Welcome to another edition of Drugs, Crime, and Politics, brought to you by the Drug Policy Forum of Texas. I'm your host, Buford Terrell. With me is my normal cohort, Clayton Jones.
How you doing this evening?
Tonight, we are honored to be joined by Dean Becker from the Drug Truth Network. You might notice for the next few minutes or so, little gremlins crawling around on the floor behind us because we're having trouble getting Dean's mic to work. So he may have to mime his responses for a few minutes, but we'll do the best we can and get him hooked up as soon as possible. We take our mandate here from the show title, Drugs, Crime, and Politics. And most of our effort is spent on those first two, drugs and crime. And when we venture into politics, it's usually in close relationship to the first two. But I'm exerting a little editorial privilege tonight to go a little bit further into the politics column. It seems like the most important debate on the national level these days is on health care reform. And as I listen to the arguments, I hear lots of heat, I hear lots of fury, lots of fear, and lots of hatred, but I hear very little fact and very little rational discourse. So I would like to recommend to you a new book that's just come out by T.R. Reid, The Healing of America. Now, Mr. Reid is a foreign correspondent for the Washington Post, and you may ask, what does a foreign correspondent know about health care? But what he has done has been to travel the world, look at healthcare systems in other countries, particularly other advanced countries, compare them to the American system in terms of outcome measurements, satisfaction of patients, satisfaction of doctors, and try to provide some factual and historical basis for it. So whichever way you're approaching the healthcare debate, and if you would like a little bit of fact to mix into your rhetoric, I think Mr. Reid's book, which is really a fun read and pretty short, I think this book is well worth your time and investment. And neither Amazon nor Barnes & Noble gives me any commission on it, so I'm just saying that this is one I think you should look for. More at home to what we usually talk about, a couple of things caught my interest this week. One of them came out of Washington, D.C. yesterday. A small group, including some people licensed to plant hemp on their farms by the state of North Dakota, and one owner of a hemp-oriented business appeared on the grass in front of the DEA office's headquarters in Washington. They had nice, shiny shovels with them. They used the shovels to dig holes in the DEA's grassy lawn and planted some hemp seeds. Now,
For 45 minutes.
For 45 minutes, and as they really intended from the beginning, they got arrested, apparently by some very polite police, but a word of instruction for anyone else interested in civil disobedience. These farmers planted sterile hemp seed, some that had been imported from Canada as a food, and which were legal since they are sterile and couldn't be used to grow a cannabis plant.
And isn't there is no distinction between cannabis and hemp as far as
plant.
So they're the same plant, so you can have industrial hemp and you can get the book thrown at you as if it was marijuana.
Well, if you have the complete plant or if you have fertile seeds, they are marijuana under the statute. If it's already been processed into fiber, or if it's sterilized seed, then there's an exemption and you can import it from overseas. So the foolish thing is our neighbors to the north in Canada can grow the hemp, process the fiber and the seeds, sell them to us legally, but we can't grow it ourselves. So,
Amazing.
and these particular protesters had already gotten state licenses to grow hemp under a new North Dakota law and currently are suing the DEA to get federal licenses as well.
But you were mentioning that the way the DEA has to slow things down was that 60-day interim period, and it's the farmers' way of trying to beat the DEA at their own game.
The DEA didn't exactly play fair in this particular setup. The men got their state licenses and applied to the DEA for grow licenses under the Controlled Substances Act, which the DEA can grant. But the DEA told them they would grant only a 1-year license, good only for one growing season. They set the application fee at, I don't remember, $3,000 or $4,000 for the 1-year application. Told them that they would have to file an application, wait the required 60-day notice and comment period before a hearing, and then they set the first day that the applications could be filed so that the 60 days would last until after the best planting date. So the farmers have turned around and filed suit, and that's still pending.
I think that they should have.
Well, let's just hope the courts say that.
Well, you know, I really do believe that our systems are starting to turn around. You're hearing it everywhere.
Yeah.
You're hearing that people just aren't putting up with it anymore.
Well, you've been telling me about what's going on in New Hampshire these days. What do you
Oh, New Hampshire, it was in Keene. They've been having a smokeout up there for the last 4 or 5 days, a 420 smokeout.
Yeah.
And the police are actually ignoring their smokeout. They were getting more attention when the police were trying to break it up. It's happening everywhere in the country, from New England to California, that people are just fed up with being told what we're supposed to think and how we're supposed to act when we know it's wrong.
Yeah. Well, I think the other big bit in the news was a bill was filed in the Massachusetts legislature this week calling for legalization of marijuana within the state.
Tax and regulate.
Yeah. And, you know, I'm always kind of fascinated by numbers. And in California, where there's quite a bit of momentum behind the legalization movement, the DEA worldwide has only about 5,000 agents, and that includes all those stationed in all of the overseas offices. The city of Los Angeles has a whole lot more cops than that. If the state law in California pulls the local and state police out of marijuana enforcement, there's no way the DEA can step in and do the job.
No.
And if you get two big population states like California and Massachusetts, it's over. The DEA just is out of business because there's no way they can handle it.
Yes, but then it's up to us as in the states that would have to, individual states would have to overturn this.
Well, let's see if Dean can make some noise yet.
Well, I wanted to kind of throw in with that thought that the DEA wouldn't be able to handle the load, so to speak.
Yeah.
I was in El Paso now 3 weeks back, and Anthony Placido spoke about the fact that the DEA doesn't go after the users. You know, they
there's a good reason.
Yes, and it's the reason you're speaking of. And I guess the point I'm trying to get at here, though, is that though they don't go after the users, they don't really object to the state and the local officials doing that, quote, on their behalf.
Well, yeah, and if you go all the way back to 1937 when the federal marijuana law was passed, Anslinger actually discouraged his agents from going after marijuana cases at all. In fact, a few times when his agents actually made fairly substantial marijuana arrests, he wrote them letters of reprimand to go into their files, telling them that they should be devoting their time to important cases. Yeah. But the thing is, it's the marijuana arrests nationwide that drive the whole war on drugs.
Right.
Oh, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, approximate 50% of the arrests are for minor possession of marijuana.
What was it, 860,000 last year?
Well over 800,000, yeah.
I mean, the American public has come out and said, the laws are foolish. You know, they're not able to be lived with anymore. They're not viable for our societal.
Every group of Americans except one. The politicians haven't recognized it yet.
But you know, with Texas Monthly recommending Texas to be the first state to legalize.
That was Bill Martin's article in the Texas Highways.
Right, and
in the October issue.
There was a panel held at that El Paso conference on the war on drugs that featured Professor Martin.
Right.
Somebody from NPR, I think Ethan Nadelman from the DPA was on the panel. Hopefully we'll have part of that for
later in
your next show. But they spoke, highly of Bill Martin's piece.
Well, Bill Martin is emeritus at Rice University, and he's a fellow with the Becker Institute of Public Policy at Rice. So he's not just simply another lone voice crying in the wilderness.
He wrote the biography for Billy Graham, if I remember right.
Okay, I didn't know that.
Yes, yeah. He's not some radical.
No, he's not. I'm not sure he would fit in at this table at all.
Oh, he would join us.
Yeah, he would.
I think, like many people with, stature, time and grade, and so forth, he's willing to speak openly in this regard.
Speaking just from self-knowledge, one of the most freeing things that can happen to a person is to be granted academic tenure. I know many years ago when I got tenure, it loosened my jaw muscles considerably.
Yeah.
So once that happens, you can say what you really think. And Bill has been doing it for a number of years. He's not by any means a late convert on this.
No, but I've noticed over the last 3 or 5 years, he really has. There's no barring discussion.
Right.
He's willing to discuss any aspect of it.
This might be a good time to remind people that this is a live show. You can call in with your comments or questions. We'll be glad to talk to you. And if you're watching either streaming video over Media Access's website or on a delayed basis on YouTube, you can get in touch with us through email to me, and we will make sure that your comments or questions are taken care of even then. But this is, to the extent possible, your show, so please call in and share with us.
I've gotten calls from people from Tennessee looking for people to testify at their state. It's happening everywhere.
Yeah.
It's not just a few Massachusetts and California, the two extremes of our country, one on each end. It's happening everywhere.
Yeah. Well, I think that's obvious when we have the hemp activity from North Dakota. We're having a really kind of groundbreaking procedure on medical marijuana in Iowa right now.
Right.
That one has already made its way past the Iowa Supreme Court. They gave directions to the Iowa Board of Pharmacy to reconsider scheduling marijuana based on their interpretation of it, and that process is now underway.
Yes, the board said that they were going to have hearings and they wanted to hear science, not myths.
And they have.
So the fallacies just keep falling down everywhere that goes, and it becomes reality to see what's really on the table, the prohibition loses each and every time.
Well, I spoke earlier about Anthony Placido, the assistant administrator and chief of intelligence for the DEA, and I captured about 15 minutes of video with him. If at your command, maybe we can share that with the
I think
viewers.
we need to do that. Normally we take a break about now. Don't know if Steve has it queued up yet, but this would be a very good time to take a break, and we'll go to see what Mr. DEA has to say right after that.
Fair enough.
It's both appropriate and at one level ironic that we sit here in beautiful El Paso, Texas, one of the safest cities in the United States, when less than a mile away from us is some of the most unbelievable carnage that I think we've seen. The rates of murder that are happening across the river, just literally a couple of blocks from here, rival what we've seen in places like Iraq and Afghanistan. And that violence is all driven entirely by the drug trade. So let's talk about it for just a little bit. And what I would tell you is that this forum, my compliments to the organizers, is important because understanding the true nature of the drug problem, the problem with illicit drugs, is both a public health problem, it's a crime problem, it is a problem of transnational proportions and American national security. It's all these things and many more. And it's difficult to get your arms around with. Many people are very pessimistic about drug control in America and American drug control policy. And I think part of that, as we saw in the first presentation, really comes from a mental framework that I think doesn't work, and perhaps some of the most unfortunate words ever uttered in terms of drug control, and that's the war on drugs. I'll talk about that more later, but what I would say at this point is that, for those of us who come from a Christian background, the first controlled substance violation goes back to the Garden of Eden. When Eve tasted of the forbidden fruit, and we've been at it ever since. We will be at it for the rest of our lives. There's nobody in this room that won't be involved in a society where we're trying to regulate certain kinds of behavior. And ultimately, it is the responsibility of governments to protect their citizens. So while we may have disagreements about the best way to do that, what the correct balance is between treatment or law enforcement, ultimately what we're talking about is the obligation of the state, of the government, to protect its citizens. Speaking of the war metaphor, and if I can debunk that just for a little bit, we're not at war with our citizens. We can't go to war with inanimate objects. We're not at war with the cocaine itself or the contraband drug, whatever type it is. And wars have beginnings and ends. You have winners and losers, and we declare victory or we're defeated, and we move on. It's over with. Perhaps a better analogy for this is really to talk about the government's ongoing responsibility to protect society and to really go after those who would peddle poison for profit. That's really what we're talking about. And I think probably if there's one key takeaway from this whole discussion, we've got many academics on the panel. I appreciate their perspectives on this, and what I would say is that drug trafficking is not, it's not bad because we happen to label it as such. In Latin, they would say malum prohibitum. It's wrong to drive over 55 miles an hour in a certain stretch of the highway because the government has labeled it as such, but it's not evil in itself to drive over 55 miles an hour. To sell poison for profit, to be engaged in the drug traffic that degrades humankind, that causes so much misery, is what we would say malum pro se, evil in and of itself. And I think that's the one thing that we can't lose sight of here, and I'll talk about that more. I think, it's said that picture tells 1,000 words, so I could talk to you about the millions of admissions into emergency department hospitals across the country, but I won't do that. I could talk to you about the percentage of people who test positive for drugs at the time of arrest. And these are not just people who are arrested for drugs, but there's a high correlation between people who are arrested for any crime and drug use. I won't do that. I could talk to you about treatment availability and how many people are in treatment for various kinds of drugs. And although we talk about marijuana as being a less dangerous kind of drug, as you can see, there are hundreds of thousands, 300,000 people in treatment for marijuana abuse. I won't talk about that either. I could talk about the drug use testing, the so-called Quest data, and how many people in sensitive jobs test positive for the use of various kinds of drugs. We could talk about students, and we saw some of these graphs already, who are using drugs in the last year, in the last month, over their lifetime. We can talk about changes in price and purity of cocaine that have changed dramatically since President Calderon took office. The price of cocaine is more than doubled, up 104%, purity down 35%. But it misses the point. It all misses the point, because what it's really about are these folks. It is about mind-altering substances that destroy human life, that destroy societies and families, and create the violence that you see a couple of blocks from where we are. The reason that we have drug policy, the reason that we're talking about all of this, is not because somebody once upon a time came up with an idea that we need to get tough, just say no. It's that these drugs are destroying people's lives. They're destroying societies and families, and in the worst case, they're undermining civilization. They're creating instability among nation states. These drug traffickers tend to thrive in areas of poorly governed or ungoverned space. And left to their own devices, they become so powerful that they challenge the nation state. It's indisputable. I don't think any of my colleagues will dispute that these drugs are not good for you. The question is really, what are we going to do about them? Harmless marijuana. I spent a few years of my career up in New York as the special agent in charge up there, and there was the cover of the New York Post one day, a little boy by the name of Deshaun Johnson, shot dead in a crossfire between two Jamaican posses, fighting it out over what turned out to be less than a pound of marijuana. These are not victimless crimes. Meth orphans, a new term coined in the 20th century. Parents who are so incapacitated that they can't take care of their children. Meth labs that are set up in places of public accommodation where every horizontal and vertical surface is contaminated. You have children living in these places. Environmental damage? You betcha. And what we see, I was actually supposed to hide this slide, but it proves the point, is that the fact is the drug flow largely, not entirely, largely comes from outside the United States. And there's a reason for that. The reason is that we've got aggressive law enforcement here. Again, a picture speaks 1,000 words. I'll try not to overdo it here. But here's the Netherlands, the Benelux countries, so-called Holland, Belgium. Huge problem with ecstasy. The manufacturers, worldwide suppliers of ecstasy around the world, do incredible damage. It's in places like Afghanistan, where the heroin trade is funding the Taliban. It's in Colombia, where we see the FARC and the AUC and paramilitaries funding their activity, and it's across the border, where the Cayo Fuentes and the Beltran Leyvas and the Sinaloa cartel fight over the million-dollar profits. What we're talking about is an industry, and a global industry. And I think sometimes we get lost on this, that we've locked up small-time, non-violent users. That's certainly not the aim of my agency, but this is 23 metric tons of cocaine seized in the port of Manzanillo that came in from Colombia. This is an industry of criminal predators who prey on the weakness of humans for profit. And if you could legalize this and snap your fingers and we change our policy tomorrow, the people that are in this business are not dusting up their resume and going to work in the corporate world. We've seen it. We've seen it with the Ariella Felix brothers over in Tijuana. They're going to be out doing extortion rackets and kidnappings and others. What we're really dealing with is a class of professional predators. And what this is really about, you know, the drug du jour may be methamphetamine or cocaine, but what separates our society from anarchy is law enforcement and collective security. This is the largest cash user in the world. Happened in Mexico City. $207 million in cash located in one place. And the individual that was selling this, Zenli Yigan, wasn't selling the finished drugs. These were the precursor chemicals to manufacture methamphetamine. The United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime estimates that the global revenue from the drug trade is $394 billion with a B. Now, that used to be a bigger number. Now I guess that represents about half a stimulus package. But it's a lot of money, and it buys a lot of these weapons that are going south into Mexico, that are going into Colombia, that are used to murder people and to undermine democratic governments, diminish respect for the rule of law, diminish people's confidence that their governments can protect them. And it is funded through the drug trade. I apologize for the graphic nature of the slides. You probably see this all the time on the news here, but this is what's happening. And it's happening not just in Mexico. It's happening around the globe. It's happening in West Africa, where they've murdered the president and the chief of the army. It's happening in Colombia, in Burma, in Thailand. You know, we went to war on 9/11 after 3,000 people were killed. 38,000 people die every year in this country as a direct result of drugs. 38,000. 7 million are classified by the Centers for Disease Control as people who are substance dependent, hardcore addicts. 27 million drug abusers. And by anybody's estimate, at least hundreds of millions of people who are affected by crime and violence and looking at people with loved ones and their families who squander their lives and their human potential and dignity. In many ways, we can talk about drug traffic, the drug epidemic, as a weapon of mass destruction. Certainly a weapon of mass effect. A, B, C, and D. This is a receipt. It was seized in Afghanistan from the Taliban. And I think you can read, but basically, the Taliban, like the FARC and the AUC and others, are bankrolling international terrorism on the backs of the drug trade. Get this slow. Can you just hit the button for me there? I think this one is hung up. Spacebar, maybe? Houston, we have a problem. Okay. And lest we think that this is a, we have another problem. The photo that's in here is a result of the terrorist bombing in Madrid. A local cell, fans of Al-Qaeda, but not really members of it, spent $50,000 in funds that derived from the local sale of MDMA and hashish. And they use that to purchase the explosives that created the problem in Madrid. Mind controller. Here we go again. You know, I will wrap up in the interest of brevity and trying to get to the questions by telling you that honest people of goodwill can have disagreements about the appropriate response to the problems of drug abuse and addiction, and whether we need to do more of one thing or another, whether it's law enforcement, treatment, education, or prevention. I will also tell you that as somebody who has just completed 30 years in the field of law enforcement, I'll be the first to admit to you that law enforcement cannot be and will never be the total response to this problem. We must have education, treatment, and prevention. But most of the people who end up in treatment don't go there voluntarily. The highest prevalence of people who go to treatment go there because they've been arrested. This is a very serious problem. It needs a serious response. Left unchecked, and I think that's what we're seeing now are the heroic actions in Mexico of the government of Mexico, realizing that these trafficking organizations have become so powerful that they rival the state in power. And the reason that the government of Mexico is so aggressively taking a stand to break the power and impunity of these organizations is not because they want to assuage the gringos, or they want to make us feel better, or they're worried about addiction in the United States. It's that these organizations are attacking the state itself. And that left unchecked, we would have very little control over what they're doing. There's reason to be very optimistic. Here you see the dots are where the known terrorists are, the arrows, the global drug flows. I think it speaks for itself. What I would say is that there's plenty of room to be optimistic. We can either argue that the glass is half full or the glass is half empty. Many would argue that Plan Colombia was a dismal failure, that we spent billions of dollars and cocaine is still coming out of Colombia. Well, I share a different view of that. 15 years ago, if somebody would have told you that the Colombian National Police would be a model of law enforcement in the hemisphere, I would have probably been belly laughing on the floor. They are today. A very few years ago, let's not forget that they blew Avianca Airlines out of the sky, that they attacked the Supreme Court and murdered Supreme Court justices, that they controlled the DMZ, or the so-called Despeje, twice the size of New Jersey, or roughly the size of Switzerland, where the government dare not go to fight these drug traffickers. Today, in 2009, the government controls every province and every department in that country. There are still drugs flowing from Colombia, and I dare say that there probably will be forever. But the government has got control, and there is a law enforcement solution. And so what I would tell you is that while law enforcement is not and cannot be the total answer to the problem of drug abuse in America or around the world, it must be part of the answer. The other things that are mentioned, the other things that are necessary, can't work if the trafficking organizations who peddle poison for profit are allowed to run amok. Thanks, and I look forward to taking some questions.
Okay, we're back. That was so full of garbage, I don't even know where to start. But why don't you tell us where this happened first?
This was in the University of Texas, El Paso. They held a major conference now 3 weeks ago. They invited people from all over the Western Hemisphere. There were people from Central and South America, lots of government and academics and scientists, doctors, authors. A lot of broadcasters gathered. There was a Washington Post, New York Times, Dallas Morning News, Houston Chronicle, BBC, The Guardian, NPR, the list goes on.
Yeah, I noticed a lot of coverage in the papers across the world from
that.
But
the two main guests who were invited, the border czar and the drug czar, had indicated they were coming. 2 days before the conference, they both indicated they suddenly couldn't come. They were sending their assistants.
Yeah.
The day of the conference, it was announced their assistants wouldn't be there either. It was a well put together conference. Yeah. There were a lot of people to refute what this gentleman, Mr. Placido, had put forward. And I just wanted to throw in this one thought that all of the violence, the death, destruction he's talking about would be diminished severely, 99% plus, if we were to tax, regulate, and control the distribution of these drugs to adults.
Well, several of us have been really seriously looking at the idea of the effect of prohibition laws on cost and price. And the rule of thumb we're coming up with is that prohibiting a substance multiplies the price by about 100. Let's take this call and then come back.
Oh, good, good.
Hello, caller. You're on the air.
Yes, Mr. Placido is fascinating. It scares me to death to think that we actually pay that idiot. But I've been wondering, and I've for years thought we should outlaw apples.
Oh.
I knew they were a dangerous drug. I mean, Mr. Placido's on top of it, but I do have a serious question.
Okay.
This guy never gives any specifics. He never answers the question about the drug itself. You know, it's like saying we outlawed alcohol and then Al Capone came along.
Yeah.
And going on and on and on about Al Capone, but he never addresses, you know, was alcohol going to actually defeat the nation?
Yeah. He called them evil a time or two, but that's about it.
Well, yeah, but my question is, and I suffer from endogenous depression, so I know that marijuana works as a medicine.
Yeah.
Has anyone ever done a legitimate medical study? Any of the major pharmaceutical companies, any major university, the Center for Disease Control, a legitimate study to find out just exactly what the potential of marijuana is as a medicine?
Okay, that's a good question.
Thank you.
First, there are no studies by the major pharmaceuticals, and you're not going to see any. Because everything about the marijuana plant and the main chemicals has been known for a long time. Therefore, nothing about it can be patented. Therefore, a pharmaceutical company cannot make sky-high profits. They're not interested. But there have been, over the past 30 to 40 years, several hundred studies of marijuana's medical use for any number of conditions conducted at hospitals, medical schools, universities, all over the country. Two places to look for a good selection of these is either in the 1995 Institute of Medicine report on marijuana as a medicine. It has good footnotes. And the 2008 American College of Physicians position paper on medical marijuana has about 7 or 8 pages of reputable, refereed, published medical studies on marijuana. So,
if I could give kind of a list of some that I recollect, Dr. Donald Abrams at UCLA, working with Letterman Hospital in San Francisco, has done several studies on neuropathy and other types of treatment for pain, found very positive results. GW Pharmaceuticals in Great Britain has produced a product they call Sativex, which is a 50% THC and cannabinoids. They tested it for use, again, with pain, with
multiple sclerosis,
and they're even now looking at it for arthritis, though those tests are
and it's
not done yet.
available by prescription in both Great Britain and Canada now.
Yes, yes. And
well, let's get this other call.
Oh, good. I'm glad they're in.
Hello, caller. You're on the air.
Yeah.
Hello. Go ahead.
Yes.
You have a thought for us?
Question about marijuana.
Okay.
Do you smoke it?
Yes, I do.
Okay.
I do.
I have in the past. I don't do much
You think
anymore.
it's good for you?
It's a lot better than alcohol.
How about you, sir? Do you smoke it?
Yeah, I smoke a lot of marijuana. I get high.
Well, right. Do you feel it impedes your progress in life, or why are you asking the question?
I think it's a hell of a drug. I think it helps me think. It makes me focus. Helps
Okay.
me see better.
Well, that's nice to know.
And speaking of seeing, there is a lady. Her name's Elvie Musica. She has glaucoma, and she receives 300 pre-rolled marijuana cigarettes per month from the United States government.
And has been doing so since the 1970s.
Yes, 20 years or better now.
Man, couldn't that save me a lot of money?
Yes, it would.
Thank you, sir. And I guess that is the point, isn't it? That the hypocrisy of it all.
Yeah.
that this gentleman Placido was talking about marijuana leads people to needing treatment, whereas at the very same time, and for 20 years plus, they have been rolling and providing these cigarettes to a select few Americans.
Well, it was at one time about 24. Over time, the number has dwindled down, so I think there are only 2 or 3 still surviving.
Very few left, yes.
What happened, the program went nicely for a dozen years or so. Then the AIDS epidemic hit. They started getting applications from what looked like could be an avalanche of AIDS victims. Mm-hmm. And George Bush, the first White House, had a cap when they visualized the word getting out that the government was providing marijuana to thousands of gays. So they shut the program off.
Yeah.
But it was done under those circumstances. I noticed in Mr. Placido's list of harms, he listed 2 things, but these were both harms caused by the drug laws, not by the drugs. He talked about the poor little boy that got shot in the shootout between 2 drug dealers.
Yep.
And I don't ever recall CVS and Walgreens having a shootout over territory or prices.
Neither Budweiser or Coors.
No. And his other one was the harm caused by illegal meth stills. Now, amphetamines in general, including meth, were one of the most abused drugs in the country in the 1950s and 60s. But they were distributed by prescription from the doctors. They were manufactured by the big pharmacy companies with no environmental damage, fully safely.
No explosions.
The first time we heard about problems with meth stills was after the federal government had made it illegal. And even now, Professor Rasmussen says the level of use is almost exactly the same as it was when it was legal in the 60s. Hello, caller, you're on the air.
You're on the air, sir.
Uh-huh.
Do you have a question for us?
Yeah.
Well?
Yeah. I want to give a shout-out to G5 Snake Gang. It's a movement.
Okay.
All right. We're looking for serious callers. Y'all, come on.
Yeah. But another thing that I started to say earlier, several of us that are looking at the price issue figure out as a decent rule of thumb, a prohibition law kicks up the price of something by roughly 100 times. So that marijuana that might cost maybe $1 an ounce goes for $100 an ounce. If you take Mr. Placido's $394 billion a year for the international drug trade, divide that by 100, that's $3.9 billion. That puts it down to roughly the size probably of the international trade in laundry soap. That's not enough to support many cartels. That's not enough to buy a lot of weapons. If you think back 100 years ago, when Joseph Stalin was one of the young revolutionaries in Tsarist Russia, he financed his operation by robbing banks. In the 1940s, the most famous American bank robber of all times, Willie Sutton, was asked why he robbed banks. His answer was because that's where the money is. And that's why the Taliban grows opium. That's why the cartels in Mexico transship cocaine. They don't give a damn about drugs. They're doing it because that's where the money is.
But weren't the Taliban against opium and the poppies? They had stopped it before we invaded?
Actually, Afghanistan didn't grow it until we invaded. Through the 1990s, most of the world's supply of opium came from Southeast Asia, Burma, Laos, Thailand, with a little bit from Mexico and Colombia getting into the picture somewhat. We financed and actually created the Taliban to fight the Russians in Afghanistan. When the Russians left, we cut off their money and they started growing opium to make up the difference. So I hear we've got to take another break. So we'll be back in a couple of minutes.
Time to play Name That Drug by its side effects. Constipation, diarrhea, dizziness, drowsiness, itching, hair loss, sweating, swelling, thirst, vertigo, inflammation of the lung, kidney disease, congestive heart failure, and headaches. Time's up. The answer, Aleve for headaches.
This week in drug war history, October 17, 1970, President Nixon spearheads the Controlled Substances Act, legislation establishing today's schedules as a means of classifying drugs strictly by their medical value and potential for abuse. October 14, 2003, Supreme Court justices reject the Clinton administration's request, continued by the Bush administration, to consider whether the federal government can punish doctors for recommending or even discussing the use of marijuana for their patients. October 15, 1986, Assistant Attorney General Mark Richard testifies before the Kerry Committee that he had attended a meeting with 20 to 25 officials and that the DEA did not want to provide any of the information the committee had requested on the Contra involvement in drug trafficking. October 17, 2002. Florida Governor Jeb Bush's daughter is sentenced to 10 days in jail and led away in handcuffs after being accused of having crack cocaine in her shoe while in drug rehab. October 20th, 2004, a groundbreaking coalition of black professional organizations come together to form the National African American Drug Policy Coalition. They urgently seek alternatives to misguided drug policies that have led to mass incarceration. This is Steve Nolan for the Drug Truth Network.
Well, we're back again. In addition to El Paso, Dean, you've also been to San Francisco for the normal meeting and a couple other places lately.
Right. It was, again, I didn't get an exact count, many hundred, I would think 750, 800 people on the main session on the first day. A lot of powerful thought relayed, but I think more than anything, what I gleaned from this particular conference was courage. People are having courage to speak this truth. People are more able and ready to, go to war over the hysteria that still some people try to foist on marijuana.
Well, I noticed that Mexico, for instance, has just passed a law decriminalizing possession of personal amounts of almost all of the drugs.
You know, the mayor of Ciudad Juarez spoke in El Paso. I'm changing conferences here, but he spoke on the first day, and he was making a lot of sense, talking about the problem, that it's a shared problem, U.S. and Mexico. But he kind of closed out his speech with the thought that he was upset by the fact that Michael Phelps was seen smoking a bong and never faced any persecution or prosecution over that. And he felt that was wrong, even though, as you say, Mexico has decriminalized small amounts. So makes you wonder.
Okay. Well, before we get this phone call, I would just say that it's pretty obvious from following anything on TV that we definitely have a celebrity exemption to most of our laws. Hello, caller. You're on the air.
Yes. You had started out your show talking about healthcare, the gentleman with the book and healthcare in other countries. I had recently had an opportunity to talk to several people who were German nationals, talking about the German system, which is a really wonderful alternative, a mixed public-private system.
Yes.
But specifically, though, I remember in the last episode you talked that the Germans had also been engaging in some drug reform and had modified their system. Could you elaborate on that, or you heard any additional information on that?
Okay. I hope Dean can back me up on some of this but as I understand it, and I'm not sure whether it's legally or simply practically, Germany has virtually decriminalized possession and use of marijuana.
Yes.
And that they have for a long time had sterile injection sites for intravenous drug users, and have recently started a Swiss-style system of providing heroin to intravenous users as well. Do you?
No, I would back that up. It's not so much that they've rewritten their laws even, but they've taken the more pragmatic approach that this is a better, smarter way to go about things. That UN Convention on Drugs treaty is a big stumbling block. America claims that it is anyway, but these other countries have shown that it's not necessarily
it's
so.
Strange interpretation.
Portugal has already proven over the last 10 years that...
Yeah.
They have indeed.
I believe we've got another caller. Caller, you're on the air. Hello?
Hello?
Yeah, the stumbling block, man.
Yes.
I don't like the drugs. You know what I'm saying? It ain't about blood, it's corrupt. It's about respect, you know what I'm saying?
Okay, thank you. You know...
Respect for truth, if I might just talk about that for a second. I mean, the gentleman, Anthony Placido, was talking about 38,000 deaths per year. What he didn't do was break that out into alcohol versus recreational drugs versus prescription drugs.
Yeah.
And I guarantee you the largest part of those deaths are from alcohol.
And also, you know, the gangs, and I don't care whether we're talking about the Mexican cartels, the Crips and the Bloods, the Mexican Mafia in Los Angeles, the Chicago gangs, Al Capone. The gangs were all there first for their own local reasons, and they picked up on drugs because it was a way to make a lot of money. Yeah. They, just like the Mexican cartels and just like Willie Sutton, go to where the money is. And I believe we have another call. Hello, caller, you're on the air.
Yeah, I'm just wondering, as the Mexican cartels become more powerful and they start to get closer, I guess, moving into the U.S., do you think that will open up the conscious minds of the politicians to ease their laws on small amounts or maybe even major amounts of drugs?
Thank you.
Good question.
I would say, first off, what we have to do is stop and look at why these gangs have any power, which, as Buford's been saying, is because of the prohibition. And secondarily, look, these politicians are in, how can I say it? They have held this position for so long that their stature, their, quote, respect, is derived from this position taken. And for them to back down now is going to be a slow, incremental process while certain politicians die off or, don't get reelected, and newer people willing to talk about potential changes, to talk about what might be a better way. Because those who have been in league for so long in this regard, it's tough for them to change their ways or to admit their failure.
Even for politicians who weren't there 40 years ago when the Controlled Substance Act was passed, most of them are afraid that coming out for change now amounts to admission of personal failure on their part. Most of them see a vote to change the laws as an almost sure way to lose their jobs.
Right.
And getting past that fear is one of the hardest things we have to do.
But there are certain states, certain areas of the country where our good friend Roger Goodman up in Washington State, state rep, got elected. The first time he got elected, he talked about time to end the drug war when he had to. Yeah. The second time he got reelected, but his Republican opponent was also calling for the end of drug war.
Yeah.
So it is changing.
One of the states, I believe it's New Jersey, but I may be wrong, there are 3 candidates for governor this year.
Yes.
And all 3 of them have come out in favor of medical marijuana.
Right.
So the change is happening.
Yes.
And I have to say to this caller that I'm among the radical group in that I don't think merely decriminalizing is enough.
No, we need to leave.
That it may give some relief to the individual user.
Prison overcrowding.
But the only way we can wipe out the bad part of the drug traffic, destroy the cartels, get rid of the violence, is to legalize across the board, to get rid of that 100 times price multiplier that fuels the whole violent business. We've got to squeeze all of the money out of it, and that means legalization.
At $1 an ounce, you're not going to get people growing marijuana.
Sure you will.
Well, in a big field.
Well,
you
not
get
to
people
sell.
growing tomatoes for 79 cents a pound.
Big field, yes.
People grow coffee for 33 cents an ounce. But we don't find Mexican cartels dealing in coffee or tomatoes. That's the point. As I mentioned, I think on email to someone the other night.
Yeah.
If marijuana were $1 an ounce and in your local farmer's market, there wouldn't be little kids getting shot in shootouts between dealers.
No.
There wouldn't be meth stills blowing up in motel rooms.
No children exposed to those fumes ever again.
And he was talking about the kid that got hurt in the shootout. One group of kids hurt by the drug war that he didn't mention are the tens of thousands of kids whose lives get totally ruined because their parents get sent to prison on low-level drug offenses.
1.8 million.
It's that high?
Yes,
okay.
Sir. Yeah.
Now, if you want to protect the kids, that's a good place to start. We're about to run out of time. We've got a city election coming up this next month. I don't know that any of the candidates have come out one way or another on any drug-related issues, but use your franchise, examine their positions and policies, ask them questions if you get a chance, and make your vote count.
We got 10 seconds?
Yeah.
I'd like to ask folks to please tune in to KPFT, which is 90.1 FM, this coming Sunday, 6:30 to 7:30 p.m. One of my guests will be Sanho Tree, Institute for Policy Studies in Washington, D.C., who just returned from a trip to Colombia.
And he has been a leading reformer for, gosh, how long now?
Yes.
He's been around longer than I have, and it's getting to be more than we want to think about.
Well, I took a trip to Bolivia with him, and it was a very interesting jaunt.
Okay, yeah. Well, in Bolivia, you're where they have been growing and using the coca leaf for thousands of years, probably. Yeah.
Every person I met, from the justice minister, Christian minister, prisoners, and the guards, all chewed coca.
Well, you know, back when Reagan was president, one of the embarrassing things was a new ambassador was sent to Colombia. They had a reception for him and offered him coca tea at the embassy.
Right.
And we're out of time. Glad Dean could be with us this week. I understand we'll have some more of his tapes next time, possibly. And we will see you back here in 2 weeks.
One day, when I'm in the middle of one of our visits to a public housing project where we knew there was some significant incidents of injection drug use, I was there showing some young people how to clean a needle with bleach, and someone had told one of the local television stations that we were there. So the reporter says to me, how do you justify this? A man